All right, we're starting. It's John's birthday today. That's why we had cake outside. Uh, right. Is everyone here? Eh, all right. Hello, everyone. I'm the host today. um, our speaker is Julia Mindlin. I know Julia from Argentina. She's from Argentina. Um, and she got her she got her bachelor's in geophysics in 2019 at the University of La Plata. I don't I don't have to memorize all these names because I know them from in Argentina, and then she went on to do a PhD at the University of Buenos Aires, and she graduated last year. So last year around this time, Julia was still working on her dissertation or wrapping up her dissertation, and now with Ted Shepard and Carolina Vera as her main advisors. And now Julia is a postdoc at the University of Leipzig. Um, um, yeah, so we have a Slido for questions for those that are online. So if you have any questions for Julia, send them there. And yeah, I think we should start and hear from Julia.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you, Pedro, for the introduction and for the invitation. I'm very happy with the opportunity to be here. A lot of people in the room did some research that was very inspiring for me during my PhD, so it's great to be here. The title of my talk, Emerging Dynamical Storylines Can Constrain Near-Term Projections of the Southern Hemisphere Eddy Driven Jet, is actually the title of the work that I've been doing during the last year, trying to answer the question that came up each time I presented my work during the PhD, almost each time. So I'm going to spend most of the talk actually talking about my PhD research, and hopefully this inspires in you the same question. Then I'm going to dedicate the last minutes to showing you what I've been doing. So I'm going to start with storylines of the Southern Hemisphere circulation. Hopefully it becomes clear what storylines are. I'm going to tell you about 3 different papers where we focused on, first, the zonally symmetric view of the circulation response to greenhouse gas forcing. Then we studied the combined effect of greenhouse gas forcing and ozone depletion, because these are the 2 main drivers in the Southern Hemisphere circulation. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how the difference in the sea surface temperature warming patterns in different models can explain differences in the zonally asymmetric circulation in the Southern Hemisphere. And then, as I said, I'm going to go to this, the actual title of the talk. So what you see here is the spatial pattern of the positive phase of the southern annular mode. This is evaluated with an UF analysis, but it's just to catch your eye and then show you what 2 different models from the CMIP 6 ensemble project in, so this is sea level pressure, project in sea level pressure by the end of the century. And what you can see here is that the trend in the models for the Southern Hemisphere looks very much like a positive southern annular mode, but models differ a lot in the magnitude of this change. And we can see this also in the time evolution of the southern annular mode Marshall-Sam index, which is basically capturing this difference between the pressure in the extratropics and 60 degrees south. And what you see is that the models disagree not only on the southern annular mode by the end of the century, but in this whole evolution is very messy. And so the whole aim of storylines is try to first understand why models disagree on the circulation response. Yeah, so that's the main goal. And this whole approach is based on the idea that we have anthropogenic forcings that drive changes in large-scale circulation or large-scale patterns that can be tropical warming, so the amplification of global warming in the tropics due to increased latent heating, or in the upper troposphere, we also have the response of the stratosphere, which strengthens or changes its seasonal evolution. And then we also have changes in the SSTs. And we argue that understanding differences in how the models represent these responses can explain the uncertainty or the disagreement in the circulation response. And this is relevant because we find, and this was the main goal of my thesis, was to show that regional climate change can be very different depending on the circulation response, and therefore understanding if there are multiple responses of the climate system that remain plausible given our current understanding of the system, then we should consider them and try to perhaps rule out some of these responses. We first looked at two drivers, tropical warming and the polar vortex. And I'll show you how the storyline approach works and how we build or construct the storylines with this example. So we start from the tropical warming and the stratosphere, because tropical warming is a very robust response. It had been studied in a hierarchy of models. For example, this is a paper by Amy Butler where they look at how the circulation responds to different thermodynamic responses, one of them the tropical warming. And they show that the Eddy Driven Jet, the zonal circulation, responds with a polar shift of the extratropical winds. And it's very interesting in this paper, they also show that all these different large-scale influences do not add up linearly. So it's a complicated problem to disentangle these different influences. But we know that this has a direct, or there's a causal influence between this heating and the extratropical circulation. And on the other hand, we also know that the stratosphere can have an influence on the extratropical winds. So this is a paper by Paolo Ceppi and Ted Shepard, my supervisor, and they showed, it was just the year that I started and I really understood a lot of things with this paper. They show that as well as in the interannual variability, if the polar vortex breaks down, so the stratospheric vortex that intensifies in winter and breaks down in spring, if this breakdown occurs late in the season, then that following summer will have a positive southern annular mode. And that manifests as well in the force response. So this figure is showing different models and a standardized index of the breakdown date. So different models show a different delay in the breakdown date as a response to greenhouse gas forcing, and that can explain the spread in the model's extratropical circulation response, and they try this as well in an idealized simulation. So these are two drivers of extratropical circulation. And so I started looking at this in the CMIP5 ensemble, and what you see is that models disagree significantly in these two drivers. The tropical warming can go from a bit more than 4 to 9 degrees, and the vortex can delay almost nothing to more than a month. And so the whole idea of storylines is profiting from the spread to understand the circulation, the extratropical circulation response. So first step of the method is try to make these models comparable, and we're only interested in the spread in circulation, and we want to therefore somehow work with the fact that models have different climate sensitivity. And for that we use pattern scaling. So pattern scaling is an assumption that allows us to say that a change in any field, so this is a field at a grid point and a model, is proportional to the level of warming in that model. So we can compare the patterns of change in different models regardless of the amplitude change that we assume will differ because the models have different climate sensitivity. And so we try to work out this pattern and how this pattern differs between models by proposing a very simple multiple linear regression where we separate the multimodal ensemble mean, so where models all agree, and two patterns that explain how models disagree because we have spread in either the tropical warming or the polar vortex. So what you see here are these two maps are just these two regression coefficients when we compute this with a simple linear regression at each grid point. So we find that the response is that to one standard deviation in this index, the models respond with a strengthening of the Eddy Driven Jet. So the black here contour shows the climatology, so red is showing that sun strengthening, and the vortex drives a power shift of these winds. And we also checked this, we looked at cyclone density with a tracking algorithm, and we find that we have increased storms and power shift of the storms in response to these two drivers. And so what Giuseppe Zappa and Ted did in 2017 was showing that when we capture these patterns that explain part of the spread in the models, we can estimate what the change in a field, in this case wind, will be under a given combination of these remote driver responses. So each dot here is showing what we call a storyline. So we consider a potential storyline a world where the tropical warming responds in this high end of the distribution of models, and for example, a late vortex breakdown, a world where the breakdown is really delayed. So what this shows is what the wind response would be under this particular configuration of large-scale responses. And we estimate this in such a way that all the different storylines are equally far from the multimodal ensemble mean. So essentially, these are just linear combinations of the maps that I showed before. And you can confirm that this is capturing the response of the models, because if you just do an average of these sub-ensembles, you get very similar responses. And so what we find is that, for example, in this particular storyline, we can compute the same procedure with different fields. And for example, if we do this with sea level pressure and estimate what the SAM response is in this storyline, we find that this is actually a high SAM response, whereas this opposite storyline is a low SAM response. So with this first analysis, we're able to separate or explain part of this spread towards the end of the century to a large extent, just because we can explain the influence of this uncertainty in these two drivers. So summary for the first part: a high tropical warming leads to a stronger Eddy Driven Jet. This projects onto a positive SAM. A later vortex breakdown leads to a more powered Eddy Driven Jet, also translating into a positive SAM. And now a question that came out of this was, okay, what's going on during the 21st century, and what is the role of ozone recovery? So this is what we did in this second paper, where we just wanted to disentangle the role of greenhouse gases and ozone depletion and recovery during the 21st century. And we know that these two anthropogenic forcings have an influence on the stratospheric polar vortex because of the thermodynamic response of the stratosphere to both of them, or at least that's one a possible physical explanation. So what we did was try to see if we could explain the evolution of the vortex breakdown delay in terms of the response to ozone-depleting substances and greenhouse gases, which again, we take in each model the global warming trend instead of a fixed CO2 concentration, because models can have different climate sensitivities. And so with this simple linear regression model, what we capture is, these are the two coefficients that I just showed. We capture how the polar vortex responds to these two forcings. And we find that we can explain the trend in this driver pretty well with just a response to ozone-depleting substances and a response to greenhouse gas forcing. And this is, I choose, of course, CSM2 to show this large here, but we find that this works very well for all the models that we analyze from CMIP 6. And so we can also look at the tropical warming spread and estimate storylines, in this case, not for the end of the century, but the whole evolution. And the way that we do that is we propose that we can either follow a high global warming or a low global warming storyline. And under that global warming storyline, we can either follow a high vortex breakdown or response to warming or a low vortex breakdown response to warming. And the reason we don't choose two different values for the response to ozone-depleting substances is that we already have enough data to show that the multimodal ensemble mean response actually captures quite well the response of the vortex to ozone-depleting substances. And so if we just take this value, we get a good representation of the observed trend in the vortex. And so under these two global warming storylines and two vortex breakdown sensitivity storylines, we are able to explain the whole spread of, these are all the models, the whole spread in the vortex evolution. And it's also interesting that regardless of the level of warming, if the vortex is very sensitive, then the trend in the vortex continues and can be very strong, whereas if the sensitivity of the vortex to the global warming is weak, then ozone recovery has a more predominant role, and we don't get back to zero, but we recover the seasonality of the vortex. And so this is more simple. This is for the tropical warming. Under these two storylines, we can have either a high or a low tropical warming sensitivity, and this also explains the spread in the models. And so with these time series, we could reconstruct what the sum, how the sum evolves in the models, but first we need to find what is the spatial pattern of sea level pressure or winds. And so in the case of the paper that I showed before, we applied pattern scaling because we were looking at changes towards the end of the century. But because we wanted to look at this, the Southern Hemisphere and during the 21st century, where these two anthropogenic forcings have different time evolution, we needed to do something different, mainly to confirm that the response of the circulation to the vortex is the same in response to ozone-depleting substances driving the vortex trends or greenhouse gases driving the vortex trends. So we propose this modification to the pattern scaling where we capture a pattern that's responding to scaling linearly with the level of warming, and a pattern that scales with the ozone-depleting substances. And then we follow the same procedure of using linear regressions to extract these patterns, choosing periods where these patterns might be maximizing their response. And we find that to a great extent, the response of this is sea level pressure, the response of sea level pressure to a delay in the vortex breakdown, either driven by greenhouse gases or by ozone-depleting substances, is a positive southern annular mode and a power shift of the Eddy Driven Jet. And we can also estimate the response to tropical warming, which is actually a strengthening of the winds, so the sea level pressure is different, both project onto the positive southern annular mode. So we use these patterns, which again are these coefficients, and the time series that we estimate to evaluate these storylines of the Southern Annular Mode Index. And we find that with these two plausible storylines of global warming and plausible storylines for the different drivers, we can explain a great part of the spread in the models. And we also find that with a very high global warming storyline, but a weak response of these drivers, we can get similar trends to what we would get with a low global warming and a high sensitivity in the drivers. So what we conclude here is that the magnitude of the uncertainty that is explained by circulation responses is comparable to the uncertainty in climate sensitivity of or the levels of warming. So really understanding or reducing the spread in the circulation response is relevant to explain the spread in this circulation. And so, summary of the second part, during the 21st century, we find this tug of war between global warming and ozone recovery. This takes place in the stratosphere, but propagates to the troposphere and helps explain part of the evolution of the southern annular mode. And in the troposphere, these trends are combined with the effect of other drivers. In this case, we only looked at how it combines with tropical warming or tropical upper tropospheric warming.
Can I just ask a question?
Yes. Yes.
It's very striking from 2000 to 2050. The spread in the models is as big as it is at the end of the century, but your lines don't seem to capture that spread.
You mean
between 2000 and 2050?
Yeah, and here.
But
Yeah.
the first half of this century, there's a lot of spread already.
Yeah.
Just jumps out.
That we're not explaining. Yeah. So I have a few hypotheses on that. So one option, we're here, as I said before, we're in a way constraining our storylines to a vortex that responds to ozone depletion compared to what we see in observations. So for example, if I were to add to that plot a storyline where the response to ozone depletion is larger, then I would get a vortex response that could be larger here. And then that could translate into explaining why in some models the response in the SAM is also larger in this peak in the year 2000. And then this could be covering part of this spread. That's one of the things that we are reducing because we have observations. It's also, as I was saying, just now we're not claiming that these are the only drivers of the trend, but we're rather trying to understand how much can these drivers explain. So it could be that in this part of the period, for example, SSTs play an important role that we're not capturing. Okay. Thank you for that question. Okay, so so now I'm going to go to the third part. So in this third chapter of my thesis, I focused on the role of sea surface temperature patterns. In the end, we didn't publish something specifically on that because we found something that was, we thought, more relevant for South America. And so I'll show you what really motivated this paper, but it's connected to asymmetric circulation and sea surface temperature patterns. When we look at the multimodal summer mean response in South America and precipitation, we see that the response is mainly a wetting, although there's a lot of uncertainty, not only on model uncertainty and the agreement of the sign of the change between models, but also uncertainty because trends are not necessarily larger than the variability in all this region. However, some models project robust in the sense that all the ensemble members agree on the sign of the change, a robust opposite sign of this trend. So for example, this is the MPI model, and it shows the drying in this region. So what we wanted to understand was if there was a possible storyline that could explain with circulation arguments or with physical arguments that this is possible, that the drying in South America is a possible response to a particular combination of SST patterns and tropical warming and stratosphere response. And so we started looking at the SSTs because we already, Carolina had done my supervisor had done some research with another student where they found that the tropical SSTs had an influence on the precipitation in South America in the long-term trends. And so we looked at the spread in the models to see if we could evaluate storylines of sea surface temperature changes. And what you see here is the mean response of the CMIP 6 ensemble and the standard deviation. And here I'm decomposing this in the zonally symmetric SST change and the asymmetric change. And we find that in the asymmetric SSTs, there's these two blobs of spread or standard deviation in the models. And we find that these are not correlated. So models are either warming more in the Central Pacific, in the Eastern Pacific, or a combination of the two. And what we wanted to understand was what was the circulation response to having these different SST patterns, and if this had an influence on the precipitation in South America. So here we follow the same approach as I showed in the beginning, but we have two additional drivers. We're using as indices these two SST responses in these two boxes. And I'm going to show you the coefficients in response to these two in particular. So in response to the Central Pacific, we find, as expected, a warming in response to one standard deviation in the Central Pacific. And we see a precipitation response that really resembles what we see, for example, in a central Niño event. And we find, here I'm showing potential vorticity and the divergence of wind and stream function and wave activity fluxes. And what we find is that, in particular, in a region of interest, the response is a wetting trend, and we find that there is some wave activity flux and a similar pattern to what we see in El Niño events that explains part of the circulation response in this region. And something similar can be said for the Eastern Pacific, where we have this warming anomaly and a Rossby wave train-like circulation. And if we look at this with more detail, we find that in response to the first two drivers that I was talking about, we see the strengthening of the tropical warming, this drying response that has also been explained and looked at as a response of the precipitation to the extension of the Hadley cell and this strengthening of the winds. And on the other hand, in response to the vortex breakdown, we find, as I showed before, a power shift of the winds, which in this region, in our region of interest, drives easterly anomalies. And in response to the Central and Eastern Pacific, we find cyclonic circulation that we argue can explain the precipitation responses. So in the end, what we were able to find in this study is that with these four drivers, we could explain why certain models show a very wet trend. This is a particular box inside this region because the response is very heterogeneous, so aggregating over this whole region really masks the signal. But in this particular region, there's a combination of driver responses that can explain a very wet trend and a combination of drivers that can explain the very dry trend. And so that was central for that paper and was central for the question that comes next, because if we can explain or rule out some of these storylines, that would be very relevant for regional climate change assessments. So summary of the third part, models disagree on the responses in these different drivers. The spread in the drivers can explain both zonally symmetric and asymmetric responses in the circulation in the Southern Hemisphere. And these different circulation changes have an influence on precipitation at the regional scale. And so here I'm arriving to the question, as I said, that came up a lot when I presented this work. So one is, can we attribute observed trends to these drivers? And the other one is, which of these storylines is more likely to occur? So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the work that we've been doing during the last months in my postdoc with Marlene Kretschmer, who works with causal inference. And we try to design an analysis to answer this question using causal inference. So here we're not looking at the spread in the models, but we're rather trying to explain observed trends. And for that, we want to make sure that we can capture and quantify the influence of the stratospheric polar vortex on the Eddy Driven Jet, the Central Pacific, and each of these drivers. And causal inference provides the mathematical or statistical framework to do this. So I'm going to try to convince you that we cannot answer which of these storylines is more likely to occur, but perhaps we can explain the observed trends in terms of these storylines. So what you see here is the latitude of the Eddy Driven Jet in the sonomean. So we see this poleward shift in the 3 different reanalyses. And here I'm showing the strength of the Eddy Driven Jet. So you see a strengthening of the Eddy Driven Jet in the 3 different reanalyses. And the black curve shows our reconstruction using this causal network. So the way that the causal network works is at each grid point, we train the multiple linear regression model. Here, these are the standardized anomalies of the different drivers. This is a standard deviation of the winds at each grid point. And so these are what we call causal maps, which quantify the response of the winds to each driver. And so to make this reconstruction, after computing these coefficients, which we tested in PI control simulations, historical simulations, reanalysis, we were quite confident of what they were showing. We multiply them by the observed time series of the drivers. So the observed trend, but also the variability. We're not detrending or anything. And what we capture is some of the variability peaks, but mainly the trend quite well. And so here in black, you see the trend that we can reconstruct only from these drivers. And then we can estimate what is the contribution of each of the drivers separately by just reconstructing the part of the Eddy Driven Jet trend that is coming from this pattern and the evolution of the tropical warming. And so we call this our attribution, and we, for example, attribute half of the trend in the latitude to global warming, which is our index that captures all the forced response that is not mediated by these other drivers. And then the remaining trend mainly to tropical warming and the polar vortex response, whereas the strengthening in the zonal mean is to a large extent explained by the tropical warming only. So we argue that we can attribute part of these trends to these drivers. And we also looked at different basins, and when looking at different basins, the different drivers explain different contributions of the trend. And so the last question is, which of these storylines is more likely to occur? And so as a refresher, when I showed in the beginning these different storylines, what we argue is that the response of these drivers to anthropogenic forcing is unknown. The current models disagree on how large this response is. So what we propose is that we can try to estimate what the wind response should have been, the trend in the wind should have been under different storylines, and try to see how well they match what we observed. So we use a hypothesis, a Bayesian hypothesis test. This is called a base factor, and it's just the ratio of the probability of observing your data. So in this case, a given time series for one of my drivers under a given hypothesis. And we compare it to the probability of having observed that same data under an alternative hypothesis, which I define as the multimodal ensemble mean. So essentially, this is just a way of quantifying how likely it would have been to observe the green curve here, which is era 5, if we were following the multimodal ensemble mean compared to being following the low tropical warming storyline or the high tropical warming storyline. And we look at different reanalysis products, and we find that it's more likely to be following the low tropical warming storyline. And we look at this in the different drivers, and we find that there is this evidence in favor that we're following the low tropical warming storyline. Small evidence against the high Central Pacific and Eastern Pacific storylines, and our results are not very conclusive regarding the polar vortex. This is a very noisy variable, and we could either be following one or the other, and it would statistically be equally likely. And so we used our causal model to model different Eddy Driven Jet trends under different storylines. So this is a similar procedure to what we did for the attribution, but in this case, we're only trying to capture the trend in the Eddy Driven Jet. And so these different curves show the different combinations of remote driver responses, and the curves show our estimates for both the latitude shift and the strength. And this plot here is showing the same number that I was showing before, just for the tropical warming, but in this case, for each of these two metrics. So so this is the logarithm of this base factor, and we take the logarithm because in some metrics this value is very high. And so if this value is around 1, or a bit over 1, then we can say that we find more evidence for a given storyline compared to the multimodal ensemble mean. And what we find is that we find larger base factors for a low tropical warming storyline and a high vortex response to greenhouse forcing. So this is this 4 storylines here. And so if you remember from before, this was associated with the wet storyline. And so this is our attempt to answer the question of perhaps not what is more likely to occur, but what can better explain the recent past. And so we find evidence for these two. We we don't find that our metric is able to say anything on the Central Pacific or Eastern Pacific responses. But this is my final plot. This is showing the trend in 3 different reanalyses for the Eddy Driven Jet for the winds at 850 hectopascals. And these are our 2 estimates for 2 different storylines that are compatible with this low tropical warming, strong polar vortex response, but with different responses in the SSTs. And this is a combination of the storyline approach and the causal inference framework. But the storylines that we're able to capture resemble much more observed trends. And what we find is that they also have a stronger response. So the strengthening is stronger compared to the CMIP ensemble mean. And yeah, so to conclude, I hope to have convinced you that storylines can be used to understand model disagreement. Models disagree on the levels of tropical warming, the response of the stratosphere, and the patterns of sea surface temperature warming. And this can explain disagreement in circulation, but also precipitation changes at the regional scale. The tug of war between ozone recovery and greenhouse gas increase occurs in the stratosphere and has a response in the troposphere. And the low tropical warming and the high polar vortex storyline better explains the recent past, or at least this is what we convince ourselves with this analysis. And we think that this can be a constraint on near-term projections. So thank you for your attention.
Awesome. Thank you, Julia. Questions for Julia? Yeah, if you are online, you can make questions through Slido. There should be a link somewhere. And questions from the room. Clara.
Thank you. Such a nice talk. Thank you so much. My question is about your attribution of the recent past with the observations and the low tropical warming storyline. Have you tried to, understand the role of relative contributions of internal variability and forced response to that tropical warming storyline, which I think you could do with large ensembles for each model. So I think that's, a big question in everyone's mind. Yeah. So that could be a nice refinement of what you've done. And then I'm very struck by the 3 different reanalyses showing very different amplitudes of, so what is our target here? I don't know, John or somebody, is ERA 5 the one to be targeting, or is JRA? That's a huge range.
Yeah, so that's a great question. We didn't look into large ensembles, but it is planned. It is written there in the plan. In this case, we are not disentangling if the observed trend is forced or internal variability. Yeah. Where I think it's harder for the SSTs, but for the tropical warming and the polar vortex, our physical reasoning is that there's no mode of internal variability, for example, in the tropics or in the polar vortex that perhaps has such a large response in order to drive these trends, but we could be wrong. In the SSTs, it could definitely be controlled by internal variability or forced response, and we're not answering that question with this.
And what about the reanalysis?
And the reanalysis, I don't know what to say. I worked in the model world during my whole PhD, and I was very excited to start looking at reanalysis and observations, and I'm not experienced enough to say, or I wouldn't know how to argue trusting one or the other more.
You have a comment, Isla?
Yeah, I think NSEP and other metrics like storm tracks is kind of an outlier
Yeah.
compared to other reanalyses and is pretty old. I wonder if you look at JRA3Q, whether it looks more like Euro 5, because that's kind of the later generation, maybe that would help. And then maybe they're converging, or maybe they're not, I don't know.
And they might have different ozone specifications also, isn't that right? Different ozone data sets.
Yeah, we'd be very interested to see why that difference is, where it's coming from.
Dave?
So with the storyline approach, you're here, how much, there's probably no way to quantify this, but can you give us a sense like how much it relies on having a large number of models? Like what if we only had 5 models?
Yeah, it's.
Would you have?
I think I said in the beginning, it relies 100% on having models and having models that disagree. And the whole idea is just to explain that they disagree, and they disagree for reasons that we can understand with our current understanding of these large-scale drivers. And if we had all models, for example, agreeing, then we wouldn't need storylines. And if we have 5 models, then the storylines will be reduced to explaining the spread that you see in those models. So I think in the beginning of my PhD, I thought storylines were explaining everything that is possible, and then I started to understand that they're explaining the spread that we have in the current models that we have, and it's constrained to that. Yeah.
Any more questions? Dan?
If I understand, the storylines have to do with linear superpositions of different impacts and their origins. Is there a way to investigate whether those possible storylines are dynamically consistent within any single model?
Yeah, that's a great question. So something that we do as a first attempt to answer that is just try to reconstruct the responses in an individual model with this linear combination of. So I'm a very visual person. So for example, we just try to reconstruct what the wind response is with this particular tropical warming and vortex response, and we can estimate part of that response, and we will have a residual. That doesn't mean that we're we are assuming that we're not explaining everything with these drivers, but we find a very similar response in many cases, and in particular with responses like the winds where in regions where the fraction of the variance between the models is largely explained by these drivers. This works quite well, but again, it's not meant to explain everything that's going on in a model. It's just trying to capture what can be the difference across the models that explained by this. But then some people are proposing to do simulations where you just try to drive these changes in the models and see what the response is. And so it would be very similar to, in this case, they kind of do that, but this is it's a much more idealized model. I don't know what would happen if you take CSM2 and you try to build these storylines, and if you find the same response, there could be like a confirmation to this.
Ayla?
Is all of this analysis being done on individual ensemble members, or are you taking ensemble means first when you have multiple members?
Yeah, good question. I didn't say that. We're taking ensemble means from each model.
Oh, okay.
So these little error bars here are showing the spread within an ensemble.
Okay.
So for example, It will also depend on the sample size, but for example, this model and this model differ more in their force response than in the ensemble, let's say. If these error bars were larger, then that would mean that you're mixing variability within the model and across models. Yeah. But there's one student now in Leipzig trying to look at storylines of internal variability, trying to explain, to look into one model only and see if you can do similar, apply similar approaches to explain spread.
Awesome. Any more questions? No questions online? Julie? Yeah.
Really great talk, Julia. In your final part, where you attribute it to the sort of low tropical warming and the polar vortex, is it possible to then look at the role of ozone versus greenhouse gases and then do that attribution as well?
Yeah,
I noticed here, like your reconstruction isn't quite capturing that flattening of the position of the jet in the last few decades.
Yeah. So ozone depletion and recovery comes in this. Well, here we're just. I'm gonna give you a bit more detail on how we compute this. So we D-trend reanalysis, and we also look at pre-industrial control simulations, and we argue that that's a way of getting rid of this influence from anthropogenic forcing and capturing the response of the winds to changes in the stratosphere, regardless of what is driving them. And we looked at this pattern in all these different historical simulations, pre-industrial control, reanalysis, and think that we can capture this link. So independently of what is driving the trends in the vortex, we can capture the response of the winds to the vortex. And so in this case, the ozone and the greenhouse gases are mixed because we're just plugging in the observed time series. But in the storylines, we are, so in this red and blue curve, we're following the same approach as I mentioned before, and we're only simulating storylines that follow the observed vortex response to ozone depleting substances. But as Clara asked before, we could propose different storylines for that sensitivity of the vortex to ozone depletion. So we try that, and so you can get estimates of your force response that have a higher peak in the vortex in the year 2000 or a lower peak. So assuming that the spread in the models in the sensitivity to ozone depleting substances is still to be considered, and then we get different storylines, but we do get that with this likelihood metric at least, we do get that it's more likely to be following the response of the observed. So we're pretty sure that this mean response captures the trend in this most significant period well, and that the spread is coming from the ozone greenhouse gas. So the ozone recovery, we only have one storyline. And then what we could do is fix a storyline with no sensitivity to greenhouse gases and see what the wind response would be. So a what-if scenario of the vortex does not respond to greenhouse gases, and then what would the wind be? That is already just perhaps asking too much of the causal model. Yeah, thanks.
Awesome. Oh, more questions.
Just go back to slide 26, could you please?
26.
And one thing I noticed was, like, after the year 2000, your reconstruction and all of the the reanalysis are really nicely sort of following each other, but prior to 2000, there's sort of something to this departure. I was wondering if that's because the reanalysis and the observations are better correlated after 2000, or whether the signal strength is stronger after 2000, or it's just coincidence that they happen to work after 2000. I mean, in the left-hand plot there.
Yeah, yeah, this looks very striking. No?
Yeah. And they're out of phase sort of before 2000, you consider.
Yeah, they're not matching well before and then. That's a great question. I don't know. Something that did come up in a recent meeting was that we didn't really look at where this variability is coming from. In this time series, I'm adding the contribution of all of the drivers. So I could do something similar to what I did here, but I only focus on the trend and try to see if these peaks are coming from a particular driver. From just looking at the patterns, it could be that the variability of the vortex, which drives a strong power shift, is dominant in this period, and for some reason is not dominant here. But I wouldn't know why that is. Good question, thanks.
Nice.
Yeah. I would just to respond to that. I think, this is in the Southern Ocean, which is poorly observed in situ wise, and it relies on remotely sensed data for the assimilation, which comes in around 1980. So everything prior to 1980 is more model dependent, I would say, than after that.
So this period would be more tied to observations at least.
Later on, you have a lot of satellite information, and so that it's just the models assimilate the same, more accurate information.
No more questions? Thanks, everyone. Great questions. That's a lot of feedback. Very well. Elizabeth sent an email with a link if you want to meet with Julia wants to meet with